The music thumped through the air, weaving around laughter, clinking glasses, and the lively energy of the party. But to Brian, everything seemed muted, his world narrowing to the small space across the room where Janet, his wife, leaned against the wall in a sultry red dress that fit her like a second skin. The crowd seemed to fade away, leaving only her and the man next to her, Ian. Brian's stomach twisted as he watched her laughter linger a little too long, her hand resting on Ian's shoulder. The scene unfurled with a painful, almost slow-motion clarity, Janet's eyes bright and flirtatious, her hand tracing invisible patterns on Ian's chest. Every gesture was like a slap to Brian's pride. He could see Ian smirking, his gaze darting from Brian back to Janet, with a self-satisfied air that made his skin crawl. Ian knew Brian was watching, and Janet didn't seem to care. Around them, friends and acquaintances milled about, oblivious to the silent battle brewing in Brian's chest. He knew he couldn't keep staring without causing a scene, but every time he looked away, his gaze found its way back. Anger, confusion, and something raw twisted within him, each emotion sharpening his sense of humiliation. Brian forced himself to walk away, weaving through the crowd as he fought to compose himself. He knew if he stayed there, watching Janet flirt shamelessly with Ian, he'd do something he'd regret. Maybe that's what she wanted, to provoke a reaction, to humiliate him publicly. But no, he thought, she wouldn't do that. Or would she? He wondered now if he even knew her anymore. He made his way to the back of the room, trying to escape the music that throbbed like an ache his temples. He leaned against the wall, hoping the coolness of the plaster would numb the heat rising in him. But the laughter that floated across the room, the occasional burst of raucous applause, every sound seemed to mock him, reminding him of his helplessness in that moment. He glanced around, trying to gauge if anyone had noticed what was happening, if anyone could see what he saw. But everyone was blissfully absorbed in their conversations, their drinks, and their own worlds. Then he heard Janet's laugh, louder this time, drifting clearly over the hum of the crowd. He turned, just in time to see her hand slide up Ian's arm as she tilted her head back, exposing the curve of her neck. Ian's gaze lingered there, and Brian felt something snap inside him. His fists clenched involuntarily as he tried to control his breathing. How long had she been looking at another man like that? How many times had she let someone else's gaze linger where his should have been the only one? He thought about confronting her right then and there, tearing her away from Ian's smug, arrogant grin. But he held back, every instinct telling him to wait, to let her make the next move. After all, he didn't want to give Ian the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. Brian took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. But as he did, the memories began to surface: the way she had started dressing differently, the way she seemed to go out of her way to look irresistible on nights she knew they'd be out in public. He had brushed it off at first, chalking it up to a harmless boost of confidence. But now, watching her with Ian, it all made a twisted sort of sense. Brian clenched his jaw and pushed off the wall, deciding he couldn't avoid this any longer. He started across the room, his heart pounding harder with every step, until he was right beside them. Janet's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a moment, something unreadable crossed her face. Surprise? Annoyance? But she didn't move her hand from Ian's shoulder. "Janet," he said, his voice sharper than he'd intended. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Ian didn't budge, that smug grin still plastered on his face as he looked Brian up and down with barely concealed amusement. Janet glanced at Ian, almost as if seeking his approval before she finally pulled her hand back. With a sigh, she turned to Brian. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, her tone dripping with irritation. "Yes," Brian said, struggling to keep his voice steady. The irritation in Janet's voice cut through Brian's resolve, igniting his simmering anger. He wanted to shake her, to demand an explanation for the brazen way she was behaving, but he forced himself to keep his voice calm. The last thing he wanted was for their friends to witness him snapping. "Let's step outside," he said, his jaw clenched. Janet rolled her eyes but followed him as he led the way through the sliding glass doors and onto the quiet patio. The muffled sounds of the party continued inside, but out here the air was crisp and still. Janet crossed her arms, leaning against the railing with a look of pure annoyance, as if she were humoring him by stepping away. "What is it, Brian?" she sighed, her tone exasperated. "You're embarrassing yourself." He let out a bitter laugh, the words scraping his throat. "Me? I'm embarrassing myself? You're the one practically hanging off another man in front of everyone." Janet's eyes narrowed, her face set in a challenging smirk. "Oh, come on, you're overreacting. Ian's just a friend. We were talking." "Talking?" Brian shot back, his voice rising. "Is that what you call it now? Because from where I stood, it looked like a lot more than that." He paused, shaking his head as the pain finally broke through. When did you stop caring about us, Janet? Her expression flickered, something softer passing across her face before hardening again. You're making this a bigger deal than it is, she snapped. I was just having fun. And maybe if you paid a little more attention to me, you wouldn't have to be standing here like this. Brian's stomach twisted. So this is my fault. You're blaming me because you can't seem to keep your hands to yourself. She laughed, a cold, sharp sound that sliced through him. You really have no idea, do you? You think you're the perfect husband, but you're so wrapped up in your own little world, you barely even see me anymore. The accusation stung, and he felt the ground shifting beneath him. He thought back over the past few months, the late nights at work, the times he'd brushed off her attempts to talk about her day. But they'd been married for years. Relationships ebbed and flowed, didn't they? They'd always found their way back to each other. That's not fair, Janet, he said, his voice quieter. I've always been here. I didn't realize you felt this way. She looked away, her gaze drifting back inside where Ian still lingered, a smug shadow in the background. Maybe that's the problem, Brian. You never realize anything until it's too late. The words hung heavy in the air, loaded with a meaning he couldn't fully grasp. Janet turned to go back inside, but he caught her arm, gently but firmly. Wait, he said, a desperate edge in his voice. Is that what you want? To throw away everything we've built over him? She shook her head, her expression a mixture of frustration and something darker. Maybe I just want to feel alive again. And Ian, he makes me feel things you haven't in a long time. Brian's heart plummeted, the cold, hard truth of her words settling over him like a weight. He dropped her arm, his hand falling limply to his side as he struggled to process her confession. I didn't know, he began, his voice barely a whisper, but the words trailed off, replaced by a hollow silence between them. Janet looked at him, her gaze suddenly tired. You never do, Brian. She turned, leaving him alone on the patio, her figure merging with the warmth and light inside as the door slid shut behind her. Brian stood there in the chill, the sound of laughter and music now nothing more than a haunting reminder of what had just shattered around him. Brian stayed on the patio, staring out into the dark garden, his mind reeling. The sting of her words echoed in his head, each one more painful than the last. She wanted to feel alive. She needed him to make her feel that. Had she truly grown so distant that she'd look to another man, to Ian of all people, for what he thought they already had? He felt like he'd been struck, blindsided by a truth that had been festering beneath the surface for months, maybe even years. The memories of their early days flooded back, fragments of laughter, stolen moments, the quiet intimacy they once shared. It had felt effortless then, as if she were his missing piece. He remembered nights when they'd stayed up talking until dawn, when a single glance across a crowded room could make his heart race. How had they drifted so far from that? He heard the door slide open behind him, and for a second, he thought, or maybe hoped, that it was Janet coming back to explain, to say it was all a mistake. But it was Ian. Of course it was. Ian strolled out onto the patio, that smug smile still plastered on his face. He walked up beside Brian, leaning against the railing with an air of false camaraderie. The audacity of it made Brian's skin prickle. Tough night, huh? Ian drawled, his tone dripping with insincerity. Brian clenched his fists, fighting the urge to turn and knock that smirk right off Ian's face. What do you want, Ian? Ian shrugged, giving a mockingly sympathetic smile. Just thought I'd check on you. It can't be easy, knowing your wife's not so happy these days. Brian's fist tightened, knuckles turning white. You think you know her? He asked, his voice low and controlled. You think because she indulged you tonight, you suddenly understand her? Ian chuckled, glancing at the house as if expecting Janet to be watching. She deserves better than sitting around, waiting for someone who's too busy to see her. Someone who doesn't know how to make her feel wanted. Brian's vision blurred with rage, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. He could barely believe the nerve of this man, standing here as if he was some kind of hero, swooping in to rescue Janet. Rescue her from what? From the marriage they'd built together, from the family, the memories, the commitment they'd shared. You really think you're that man? Brian said, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. You think it's just that easy to walk into someone's life and take what you want? Ian shrugged, unfazed, his eyes gleaming with arrogance. I think she's already made her choice, Brian. You just haven't caught up yet. The words hit Brian like a punch to the gut. He had known, deep down, that something was broken. But hearing it out loud that Janet had already made her choice, and that choice wasn't him felt like his whole world was unraveling. Ian turned as if to leave, but Brian grabbed his shoulder, pulling him back to face him. "You think this is a game?" he hissed, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You don't just get to waltz in and break up a marriage, ruin a family, and walk away." Ian shrugged him off, straightening his jacket with that same insufferable grin. "Maybe it's time you figured out that not everything's about you, Brian. Some people just move on." Brian's restraint snapped. He swung, landing a solid punch that sent Ian staggering backward, his grin finally wiped clean. But Ian quickly recovered, lunging forward, his own fists flying. They grappled, fists connecting with bone, raw anger spilling over as they wrestled in the dim light, each punch an outlet for years of buried frustration, of betrayal and humiliation. Eventually, a few people from inside heard the commotion, rushing out to pull them apart. Brian was panting, his face flushed, his hand throbbing from where he'd landed the punch. But the satisfaction of seeing Ian bloodied and shaken, his confidence shattered for even a moment, gave Brian a grim sense of closure. Through the blur of voices and concerned faces, he caught sight of Janet watching him, her face a mixture of shock and something else he couldn't decipher. She didn't move to stop him or defend Ian. She just stood there, her eyes locked on him with a kind of resignation that stung more than the fight ever could. The guests who had pulled Brian and Ian apart cast uneasy glances between the two men, unsure of what had just exploded in front of them. Brian's chest heaved, the aftermath of adrenaline leaving him lightheaded and raw. He felt the sting in his knuckles, the unmistakable throb of skin split on bone, but he barely registered the pain. His eyes stayed locked on Janet, her face pale and expression unreadable, as she stood near the patio doors, arms crossed defensively, watching him as if he were a stranger. Ian staggered back, wiping blood from his lip, his confidence shattered as he glared at Brian. But there was no fire left in him. The cockiness, the self-satisfied arrogance, all of it, had drained away, replaced by a kind of sullen defeat. One of their friends guided Ian back inside, his shoulders slumped, his aura of triumph completely dissolved. Watching him go, Brian felt no satisfaction, just an empty numbness where his anger had been. As the crowd murmured and shifted, someone touched Brian's arm. He glanced down to find one of Janet's close friends, a sympathetic but pitying look in her eyes. "Maybe it's best if you go home, Brian. Let her figure this out." Brian almost laughed at the irony of it, at the way his world had been upended in a matter of hours. But instead he nodded, his voice rough as he replied, "Yeah, maybe you're right." He turned back toward Janet, searching her face for some flicker of regret or remorse, some sign that there was still something left of the woman he had married. But her expression remained closed off, defensive, as if she had nothing to give. The truth settled in his chest, heavy and final. "Was any of it real, Janet?" he asked, the words barely more than a whisper. She flinched, as if struck, her eyes darkening, but she didn't answer. She simply looked away, her silence speaking louder than any words could. Brian forced himself to walk past her, heading toward the front door. The house felt like a mausoleum now, a hollow echo of all the memories they had shared, memories that now felt like shadows of a life he no longer recognized. He could still hear the faint hum of the party behind him, laughter mingling with music, as if nothing had changed, as if his life hadn't just been torn to pieces. He left without a word, stepping into the cold night air. He stood on the driveway for a moment, the weight of his realization finally settling on his shoulders. He was alone. He had been alone for longer than he cared to admit. Somehow he had believed that love, commitment, and shared memories would be enough to hold them together. But now he saw the truth. Those things hadn't been enough for Janet. Perhaps they never had been. The drive home was a blur, his mind a storm of thoughts and unanswered questions. He kept replaying the evening in his head, as if searching for the exact moment everything had gone wrong. Had it been months ago? Years? Had he been too blind, too wrapped up in his own life, to see that he was losing her? Or had she simply decided to discard him for something newer, something that made her feel alive in ways he apparently couldn't? When he reached the house, it felt empty, colder somehow, stripped of the warmth he had once associated with home. He wandered through the rooms in a daze, memories tugging at him with every step. The photos on the wall, the little knickknacks they had collected over the years, each one a testament to a life he thought they had built together. In their bedroom, he stared at the bed they had shared for so many years, feeling like a stranger in his own home. He sank onto the edge, burying his head in his hands as the reality settled in fully. There was no going back. Janet had made her choice, and it wasn't him. The anger flared up again, but this time it was quieter, hollow. He realized that whatever love he'd thought he could salvage had already been poisoned by the betrayal, eaten away by months of neglect and resentment. Even if she came back tomorrow, begging for forgiveness, he didn't know if he could ever look at her the same way again. Sometime later, he found himself at the dresser, packing a bag on autopilot. He grabbed his essentials, shoving clothes, his toothbrush, and a few belongings into the small duffel. His mind was made up before he even realized it. He couldn't stay here, not tonight. Maybe not ever. He scribbled a note on the notepad by the kitchen, the words coming with surprising ease. I need space. I don't know how long I'll be gone, but please don't try to find me. I need to think about where we go from here, if there's even a place for us to go. With one last look around the house, he stepped out into the night, closing the door quietly behind him.